Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Gadd. I'm a professor of English literature at Bath University, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. I'm here to talk to Professor Rob Morrison about his recent book, The Regency Revolution, Jane Austen, Napoleon, Lord Byron, and the Making of the Modern World. Rob Morrison studied at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta in Canada, then at the University of Oxford, and then at the University of Edinburgh. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Manchester, and then became, in 1992, an assistant professor at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. Currently, he is British Academy Global Professor at Bath University, so a colleague of mine, and also Queen's National Scholar at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He specialises in 19th century British literature and culture. In 2017, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His most recent book is The Regency Revolution, the book we will talk about, which was also named by The Economist as one of its books of the year for 2019. He's also author of a biography of Thomas de Quincey called The English Opium Eater, which was shortlisted for the James Tate Black Prize. And his edition of the selected writings of Thomas de Quincey was published by Oxford University Press last year in its 21st Century Oxford Authors series. And his edition of Jane Austen's Persuasion was published by Harvard University Press. As I mentioned, he is a colleague of mine. He joined the English department at Bath University as a global professor last year, and he's been giving lectures and seminars to students alongside his research duties. He is, like we all are, on lockdown at home, in his case, with his family back in rural Ontario. And so I'd like to welcome Rob to this interview, conversation, talk, call it what you will. So hello, Rob.
Hello, Ian. Thank you very, very much.
So we're recording this on my laptop here in the UK, but we are reliant on the vagaries of the internet, both here in the UK and more to the point in rural Ontario.
But vagaries is the right word.
We're going to talk for about half an hour about the book, but I want to start off by showing, if I can share my screen here, the covers of the book in question. So just to explain, there are two covers here, one for the hardback on the left and the slightly jazzier one or punky one, depending on your perspective, on the right. But let's start with the basics, Rob. Most of us, if we've used the word Regency, we've used it in to describe furniture or something similar. Do you want to just explain what the Regency was, why it's called the Regency, and why it was a particularly important period in British history?
Sure. There have been many regencies in British European history. The regency I'm interested in extended from 1811 until 1820. And a regency occurs when the reigning monarch is unable, either because of some sort of medical incapacity or because of he or she is 2 years old. A regency happens when the monarch is unable to fulfill his or her duties, and so someone is appointed. In the case of my interest, the Regency Revolution, it's because George III finally, in 1810, he's had bouts of mental incapacity on several occasions across his reign. His reign started in 1760, and there was what was called the Regency crisis in 1788, when the king's mental capacity seriously declined, and his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, George, Prince of Wales, looked like he was going to take over the government just 1 year before the French Revolution. And then all of a sudden, George III recovered, and his son went back to being Prince of Wales. In 1810, George III did not recover. And so his son, who was about as opposite to his dad as you can imagine, took over the government and in effect became the monarch. And so he reigned as the Prince Regent from 1811 till 1820, January 29th, 1820, so 200 years ago this year, when George III died, and then the Prince Regent became George IV, and he died in 1830, and then pretty soon we get his brother, and then we get Victoria. So the Regency is this remarkable period. It covers most of the second decade of the 19th century, and it is a constitutional reality, but it's also sort of a remarkable decade just in and of itself. So Regency refers to architecture, it refers to furniture, it refers to all kinds of things, but I'm specifically interested in that one decade.
And I think that's a good point to say that, to explain a little bit about what kind of history this is, because as I know very well, as we're colleagues, you are a very well-known literary scholar of this period, and this is a history, but it's not a political study. It's not a narrative history. It's more about painting a world in a decade. And that's something that is clear from the, as you can see on the screen, the title and the subtitle that suggests that this is not your dry history that you might expect. So I wonder whether, if I show a picture here of the Regent, whether you might read a little bit from the opening of the book, which I think will give a good flavour of the kind of approach you're taking.
Okay, well, yeah, this is from the prologue to the book. I'll just read a little bit of it. It is, I don't come to this as a political historian. I don't come to this as somebody who was well versed in the Corn Laws or something. I come to the Regency as someone fascinated by Lord Byron, Keats, Jane Austen, the Shelleys. And I would like to think that gave me a different perspective on the period, and one that I hope sort of changes people's minds about what happened during this this decade. So one of the things that was exciting for me about the book is I wrote about Wellington. I wrote about Charles Babbage as a scientist. I wrote about George Stephenson as an inventor. I wrote about Thomas Telford as the most important engineer of the period. So it pushed me onto that ground in a really exciting way. But there are lots of literary figures like Maria Edgeworth, for example, who talks about Thomas Telford. And Jane Austen is very interested in the condition of British roads as we are today, how you get around and what the development of roads meant. For example, there is a comment on it, you wouldn't expect it, but it's in Pride and Prejudice, where Darcy asks Elizabeth about traveling. And so the kind of history I tried to write was one that brought the world of the Regency to life. So this is how the book starts, and I'll just read a little bit of it. This is the prologue, and it's called The Regent, who's before us on the screen. That's if you like the Regent. That's a conservative and laudatory view of him. The Regent and the Regency. He burst into tears. It was May 1812, and his erstwhile friend Lloyd Moira had just explained to him that the country was in a terrible state. The Prince Regent admitted ignorance. He had not received any news from his ministers in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and he did not know what was happening in his kingdom. How bad were things beyond the opulent confines of his home at Carlton House in London, or his seaside retreat at the Brighton Pavilion? The answer, as Moira undoubtedly informed him, was that things were very bad indeed. In Ireland, there were government crackdowns and bitter outbreaks of sectarian violence. In Scotland, landlords were clearing their estates for sheep farming by forcing thousands of Highlanders from their homes. And in England, there were riots in the industrial Midlands and widespread despair in the agricultural districts. And this was to say nothing of the monumental struggle Britain was waging in Europe against Napoleonic France, or the anger building between America and Britain that led, less than a month later, to the two countries descending into the War of 1812. Long before Moira had finished, the Regent was very nearly in convulsions, and Moira suggested to him that he return the next day in order to allow the Regent time to compose himself. Yet despite the stress These meetings caused the regent, and the turmoil that continued to sweep through the country, the regent rarely took more than a sporadic interest in domestic politics. The result was repeated and often ferocious attacks on him by satirists, caricaturists, political enemies, and discarded friends, all of which created an image of him as self-indulgent, incompetent, and lachrymose that has endured from his day to ours. Nonetheless, if widely despised and too often oblivious in matters of state, the regent in matters of taste and style left a profound impact on his era. For in his love of both elegance and excess, violence and restraint, learning and lasciviousness, the low brow and the high-minded, he embodied many of the extremes that have come to define his regency, not only within court circles, but also much further down the social hierarchies. His love of prize fighting, horse racing, and the theater set the tone for the age, as did his delight in consumerism. Gamblers bet wildly like him on cards and dice, losing far more than they could afford and racking up cripplingly high debt loads. The regent's vast consumption of food, and especially drink, empowered male and female debauchees from across the social spectrum. His days and nights of committed libertinism inspired rakes of both sexes, who throughout the Regency enjoyed an unabashed revelry of promiscuity and pornographic obsession. The regent had passions, however, that extended well beyond the stimulations of sport, gambling, sex, booze, food, and shopping. His cultural, aesthetic, and literary judgments have proven remarkably sound. John Rennie was his engineer and John Nash his architect, and together their building projects transformed Regency London. In fashion, he was for many years an intimate of George Beau Brummel, who set new standards for sartorial eloquence in male dress. In art, he commissioned portraits from Thomas Lawrence and genre paintings from David Wilkie. In prose fiction, he championed Jane Austen, who did not admire him, but who dedicated Emma to His Royal Highness, the Prince Regent, and who was read and admired by him at a time when her works enjoyed only limited popularity. In poetry, the regent, like so many of his contemporaries, thought Walter Scott preeminent until George Gordon Byron, 6th Baron Byron, skyrocketed to fame in March 1812 with the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, whereupon the regent asked to meet Byron, whom he surprised and delighted with his intimate knowledge of poetry and poets. In science, the regent knighted Humphrey Davy, the most eminent chemist of the day. The works of scientific men, Davy declared, are like the atoms of gold, of sapphire and diamonds that exist in a mountain. When sovereigns are at the expense of digging out these riches, they are repaid by seeing them gems in their crowns.
Thank you, Rob. I think that gives a real flavour of your style and your tone, but also the kind of wide range, the scope, how wide the range of your scope is. I brought up on the screen, because we showed while you were reading that, two of many portraits of the regent himself, and we just got them up as a kind of comparison, because they do reflect the rather divided view
of the
regent himself. So could you talk us through those two?
Yes. Well, the one on the left, as we're looking at the screen, is the regent as his supporters would see him, or at least supporters of the monarchy. There were many people who didn't really like what the regent was doing, but they were devoted to the monarchy. So here he looks regal and in control and stately and king-like. And if you were conservative in the way, for example, that Walter Scott or Wordsworth or Robert Southey was, this is the image of the monarchy that you wanted portrayed. On the right is a caricature by George Cruikshank, who is, we think of him as sort of, he's best known for his relationship with Charles Dickens, who was born, by the way, in the Regency. But this is Cruikshank in the Regency. There are several images in the book that are from Cruikshank. He was everywhere and commented in such a searching way on the political and cultural events of the day. And this is a picture of the monarch that Cruikshank draws after the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. The first chapter of the book builds towards the terrible day in August 1819 when the British military turned on the British citizenry. And this is a picture of the Regent, pot-bellied, decorated in a military costume, though he didn't serve in the military, glassy-eyed because he was addicted to opium and booze, and in every way sort of unfit to be the leader of the country, both politically and morally. And if you look closely, you can see that off his belly is hanging a corkscrew, which I think accounts for the glassy-eyed stare. So Cruikshank developed an image of the Regent that is still with us today. That is overweight, drinks too much, gambles, is lascivious to and inconstant to an extraordinary degree, a spendthrift, a wastrel, someone who doesn't deserve the riches that are all around him. And in some ways, that's endured from that day to this one. I think it is more accurate to say that for all his faults, the Regent did have some qualities that redeemed his character, and his aesthetic and literary and cultural judgments are among those.
That would be a good point to, I'm just going to stop the sharing there. So you can, I'm not sure whether there is an improvement that we're now on the screen rather than the Regent, but you mentioned just before you started reading from the book that for you as a literary scholar, this was a period that was rich in terms of Austen, Scott, Byron, Wordsworth and Keats are still writing, obviously, at this period. But it's also a period that, in terms of politics, it's you mentioned Peterloo, obviously it's the height of and the kind of resolution of the Napoleonic. Did you feel that as a literary scholar, you were able to bring a perspective that historians connected in that way, in terms of the literary and the historical?
Well, what I discovered, I mean, you know, you're trying to think, what kind of book could I write about the Regency? What hasn't been done? What might I say? And when I realized that, for example, Austen published all six of her published novels came out in the Regency: Sense Sensibilities, 1811, Pride and Prejudice, 1813, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion, and then Northanger Abbey. When I realized that all six of those came out in the Regency, then it was I started thinking, what else came out in the Regency? And of course, Byron skyrockets to fame, as the introduction says, with Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and Mary Shelley publishes Frankenstein, and John Keats writes and publishes his greatest work, and Percy Shelley and Coleridge. And then you start to think, well, what else did they do? And so when I talk about Pride and Prejudice and Rhodes, I'm interested in Pride and Prejudice as, I think, the greatest love story of the past 200 years. But what was really exciting for me was when I decided on this topic, for example, sitting down and rereading all of Austen, and rereading Mansfield Park. And there's a moment in Mansfield Park where Tom refers to the events in America. And I can remember sitting in this library, putting down the book and going, the events in America? Just a minute, what's he talking about? And what he's talking about is the War of 1812. And it was in moments like that that I thought, you know, there's something here. We don't think of Jane Austen, who two of her brothers are sailors in the British Navy. We don't think of Jane Austen as someone who comments on the War of 1812. So there are greatest hits. I do spend time talking about Pride and Prejudice. I can't give any lecture on any topic without talking about Pride and Prejudice. However, what was also exciting for me was when I realized that Austen and her brother went through a Regency prison, and Austen talked about the prison. We think of Elizabeth Fry, one of the greatest women of the Regency in my view, but Austen went with her brother through a prison, and Austen talked about the War of 1812. And so what I tried to do is to talk about Austen in some of the terms that we already think of her, but also to talk about the ways in which Percy Shelley talks about animal rights, or Jane Austen talks about roads and the War of 1812. And so I tried to get out of writers that we think we know perspectives and topics and ideas that they don't. I tried to show them sort of more aware of their world, especially Austen. I think Austen is very, very often reduced in ways that are a disservice to her greatness. And I tried to present a Jane Austen and other authors who were aware. John Keats talking about prostitutes in Covent Garden. We know Keats has got an interest in that sort of thing, but I wanted a book that brought out those sides of those major personalities, neglected sides of major personalities.
And I think you achieved that really remarkably. And actually, one of the things that is most engaging about the book is the way in which it approaches the period, not year by year, but thematically. And
Yes.
actually, those themes are broadly defined. So there's one about the politics, which, as you say, it talks about the assassination of the Prime Minister, it talks about the Napoleonic Wars, but it also talks about Peterloo and about radical politics. So all those chapters, they take their themes, but each theme really encompasses a wide variety of social experience at the time, and actually, of course, it's also very. We'll come back to this. It's also a very modern account in that it pays attention to those aspects of Regency culture that the Victorians, for one, definitely didn't talk about.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, we don't want to get too X-rated, but this is a period, as you said, that this is for people like the Regent and those in the more socially elevated classes. There was scope there for lives of considerable sort of debauchery and scandal, with gambling, drug use, drink, pornography, prostitution, and so on. So do you want to give us a little bit of a flavour of that? Not least because for many people, they will be assuming that the Victorian era was that the attitudes there were already prevalent in this period, but it seems that wasn't the case then.
The Victorian period, people like Thackeray, the great novel of the Regency is Vanity Fair, which for the most part is set in the Regency. And Victorianism is, there are all kinds of people who talk about this. Victorianism is a reaction to the excesses and rakery and debauchery. Thackeray sort of, tuts his way through his survey of George, the Prince Regent, who becomes George IV, because of his scandalous behavior. And Thackeray, I don't think of as prudish, but Thackeray just cannot believe that any society would put up with the Prince Regent. And so what he's talking about is the levels of gambling, the levels of promiscuity. And it's not, promiscuity isn't new, but the way in which it was celebrated, the way in which it was utterly open, the way in which people, conducted adulterous affairs, in public, as it were. Victorianism is very much certainly can be read as a reaction against what the Regency represented. So in sexual terms, there's a booming trade in pornography. There's a booming trade in prostitution. And it is horrifying the way how young some of the females are who are enforced into prostitution. Horrifying. And the numbers of women who are forced into the sex trade is horrifying. And there are religiously inspired men and women who can seem killjoys and can seem prudish, and some of whose campaigns are frankly a little bit silly sometimes, or at least in their extreme versions. can be silly. But what they're trying to do at some level, some of them, is improve the lives of women, improve the lives of the people who don't have very much money and who are living in extremely poor conditions. We can get a picture of the Regency, especially if we read novels like Jane Austen's, as very elegant and refined and quite wealthy. And then as now, that applies to a class of people that's far too narrow and small. Suffering, the level of human suffering in the Regency is appalling. And I tried to bring out in the chapter on sexuality the ways in which especially the lives of women were thwarted and irreparably damaged in thousands and thousands of cases, maybe millions over the course of the period around the world, for sure. And so I really wanted, sexuality was a big theme in the Regency because, for example, the greatest comic poem in the English language, I think, is Lord Byron's Don Juan. And Don Juan is all about libertinism. And one of the things I tried to bring out is that openness about sexuality, there's a side of that, of course, that's quite healthy, that's quite positive. People were not so pent up and het up, and so women got badly hemmed in the Regency. But there was a liberalism and a freedom that in some cases, certainly in Lord Byron's case, was quite helpful. It produced Don Juan. It also produced a kind of healthy hedonism for both men and women. But as I tried to bring out, too often women are objectified and driven to the margins. And that's why, for example, the book comes back again and again to women like Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer, and Maria Edgeworth, the novelist, and Jane Austen, and women who showed a lot of strength and a lot of courage in a very patriarchal and often testosterone-filled world. So sexuality was sort of a focus because of how crucial a role it played in the lives of men and women then as now.
Yeah, and that also touches on another theme that runs throughout the book, which is what we might call the development of progressive attitudes to sexuality, to political reform, to social reform, and so on. So alongside some of the conservatism you've talked about, and then some of the hedonism you've talked about, actually, Elizabeth Fry is an example of that. But you've got a whole array of radical thinkers and activists in that period who are agitating for a better world. Do you want to highlight one or two that you think deserve mention?
Well, Percy Shelley, who's a poet that I admired before I began the Regency, and he's a figure my admiration went up and up and up. He's on top of all the crucial issues in the age. It's remarkable how many things he commented on that matter now, from food security to democracy to secularism to homosexuality to sexual identity. And Shelley, for me, is on the right side of all these issues. He believes in democracy, he believes in secularism, he believes in humanity. He's a terrible dad, and there are sides of his personality that are hard to there are sides of his personality that are more difficult, more problematic. All you have to do is read Frankenstein to see how problematic it could be if you were in a relationship with Percy Shelley. However, on things like homosexuality, if you are homosexual in the Regency and you are caught in a homosexual act, you are tried and then you are taken and hanged. People were it was moments of state orchestrated persecution where homosexual men, not women, because they didn't even believe lesbianism existed, but men are hanged. So you have all these Regency men, including Lord Byron, who go to the continent because not only is it not illegal, people aren't even fussed about it. But in Britain, it is, you are killed for your sexual preferences if they don't fall into line with a very narrow definition. And so Shelley, for example, is one of the very few people who comments on the atrocity of killing people for their sexual preferences. And so Jeremy Bentham is another person who very bravely, he doesn't publish it, but he writes at length about the heinousness of killing somebody because of their sexual preference. And that was an example of a topic that I think really does anticipate the modern world. A lot of what Bentham, a lot of what Shelley, a lot of what a man named William Beckford, who spent his last 20 years in Bath, what Beckford said. Beckford was a gay man, what we now call a gay man, and Beckford finds one day that reads in the Times that someone has been killed because he was caught in a homosexual act. And Beckford says, I can't imagine what deity they think they are placating with the killing of these innocent people. And that's a pretty prescient comment. And one of the things that really galvanized me throughout the book was the ways in which what was happening then shapes how we think now. There is an enormous difference between how we regard sexual identity now as opposed to back then. And I always say to my students, well, how did that happen? How did we change and broaden people's minds? And the answer is, for me, William Beckford and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and the people who had the courage to speak out against intolerable injustices.
And yeah, that I think comes through loud and clear in the book. I mean, your subtitle is The Making of Modern Britain, and you talk about this period as a decisive break from the past and one of the desiring democratic, secular, opportunistic society that is for the first time recognizably our own. And I think that sense of I think that's again something that readers will really see in the book, the way in which you are talking about a world that is 200 years ago, but yet there are elements in there that are not only recognizable, but actually, as you say, we can trace back from now to the lives and the experiences of people in the Regency period.
Yes.
One of the other things I was going to say that I enjoyed a lot about the book, and I always do this. I always look for this when I'm reading histories of periods, particularly periods that are not quite my area of expertise, and it's looking for alongside the stellar cast, the usual suspects, of which the Regency, as you said, has more than its fair share. It's looking at those names that in the period would have had immense currency as well. Would have been the heroes and heroines of their day, or whether it's whichever sphere they were in, and learning a little bit about them. And you have little vignettes of two of the most famous boxers in that period, of actors and actresses. Are there any particular individuals that you discovered that you had perhaps never heard of, or had only heard of in passing, that you hadn't really fully appreciated their importance until you wrote the book?
There were. This is a period that is early 19th century British literature and culture that I, when I thought the start of the book, I thought, well, I sort of, I've taught that, I've written on that, I've published on that. I sort of know the contours of that pretty well. And of course, one of the exhilarating things is you get in there and you think, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know she knew him. I didn't know that he went to that and then talked about that. And that I didn't know that Turner and Constable sat across from each other at the dinner table at the Royal Academy in the dinner of 1812. I didn't know that. I didn't know the Regent commissioned portraits from commissioned of genre paintings from David Wilkie. I didn't know, so on and so on and so on. And that, when you sort of think you know the ground, and then you discover this is so much more interesting than I thought. And one of the figures that stands out for me is Dorothy Jordan, who was a mistress of the man who became William after his brother George died, before Victoria, King William. And another person, she was the most talented and successful comedian of the day, female comedian. of the day. And the reports of her acting by Byron and by Benjamin Robert Hayden, they're in raptures at the talent and ability, the way she delivers her lines, the way she plays different parts, the life she brings to a play that everybody knows. I was really impressed, really excited by what people said about Dorothy Jordan. And the other person is a man named Pierce Egan. And Pierce Egan wrote sort of a walking tour of Bath in 1819. He published, you arrive in Bath and you walk around and here's what you see. And he does it in a very engaging style. But Pierce Egan is the first modern sports reporter. And he is really, really interesting. And his great sporting love, like many, many in the Regency, is boxing. And when Egan writes about a fight, the dialect he uses and the lingo he uses and the insider knowledge he uses and the way he turns these battles into epic struggles between, the forces of might. And it is a remarkable tour de force that sort of takes sport. Sport is central to many, many people's lives now. And when Egan talks about what sport brings to somebody's life, the excitement, the color, the controversy, it just feels very much like today. And because he is so invested in who wins what fight, when, and how, and writes at such length about it, I found him a fascinating figure. In 1820, just as the Regency ends, he also publishes something called Life in London, which is this extraordinary celebration of the qualities we associate with the Regency, from boxing. The heroes in this book go to the opera and then they go visit the boxing champion. That sort of range of interest, the way in which boxing is intellectualized, and the way in which it's commonplace to talk about a poet and a boxer and an actor and a sculptor in one evening. I find that very exciting, and Egan brings that to life in a way that virtually no one else does. So he was a figure that I knew. I knew the name Pierce Egan, but boy, he was very, very well known at the time. And I dare say there are people who will listen to this who have not heard of Pierce Egan. He's a really interesting person, writer, figure.
And that, I think, might be a great place to wrap this up. I mean, Egan, in some ways, is perhaps the model for your book. In some ways, someone who is able to bring all these different figures from different walks of life together, and to make them leap off the page in terms of their vitality and interest. And so I commend this book, The Regency Revolution by Rob Morrison, to everyone who is still with us at this stage. And Rob, thank you so much, all the way from Canada. And I think we will call that a wrap.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you.